Welcome, everyone. Today's masterclass in public policy is Everything Wrong with the Green New Deal. Our speaker is Isaac Orr, Policy Fellow at Center of the American Experiment. Isaac is a graduate of the University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire and is the principal author of Doubling Down on Failure, the American Experiment report on green energy that last October won the State Policy Network's prize as the most influential research of the past year. If you want to ask a question or make a comment, just hover over the bottom bar of your Zoom window and click where it says chat. A chat box will pop up that you can type in. And if you select all panelists and attendees, there's a menu there, everyone will be able to see your comment or question. Now, Isaac, take it away.
Hello, everybody. Happy Tax Day, or what was Tax Day. I'm sure you're all in a better mood as a result of that. Some silver linings in the COVID-19 cloud. Thank you for tuning in. My talk is called Everything Wrong with the Green New Deal, and seeing how we are a Minnesota think tank, I figured I would bring this down to the Minnesota level. So this is a picture of AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, with our governor, Tim Walz, shortly after she was elected. So what's wrong with the Green New Deal, you may ask? Virtually everything. So the four takeaways I want everyone to take for today are: one, the Green New Deal style policies will hurt Americans financially, but produce zero measurable environmental benefits. And for that reason, I think it's safe to assume the Green New Deal and the versions of it being floated around in Minnesota are not about climate change. They're about regulating every aspect of the economy. And another thing I often hear is, well, wind and solar, they're winning in the marketplace. This is not true. Wind and solar are actually 100% reliant upon government support, and they will increase electricity bills for you, your family, local schools, hospitals, which is a big deal right now, and businesses. And lastly, there is no free market for electricity. And that's important to know because utility companies like Xcel Energy here in Minnesota are not private companies. And you as a consumer are forced to buy your electricity from this monopoly. You don't have a choice in that. And the other thing about it is utility companies are guaranteed to make a profit every time they spend money on a new power plant. So unlike virtually every other business, they are guaranteed to make their money back. So this rewards them for making bad decisions and creates a very bad incentive structure. And as John Phelan, our economist, has written about several times, incentives matter. So what is the Green New Deal? In my opinion, it is one of the most dangerous and extreme proposals offered in modern US history. It has an estimated price tag of $93 trillion. It vows to completely eliminate the use of fossil fuels. It has a $5 trillion price tag estimated for the renewable energy to go 100% renewable. But I actually think that's way too low. It has jobs guarantees for people who are unable or unwilling to work. And it doesn't allow for nuclear power. And, I think that one of the things liberals think that they can just say that, they can use climate and environmental policy as a bludgeoning tool to change the entire economy. They seem to think all they need to say is existential crisis, and it gives them a blank check to do whatever they want. And, when I used to work at the Heartland Institute, and when I worked there, some of the older guys would say, oh, well, greenies are just watermelons. They're green on the outside, but red on the inside. And I always kind of cringed when I heard that because, I think there's a lot of well-meaning people who do have legitimate concerns for the environment, and they aren't just using this as a Trojan horse for socialism. But it gets harder to think that when the former staffer for AOC, who was in charge of the Green New Deal, was telling the Washington Post in an interview, the interesting thing about the Green New Deal is it wasn't originally a climate thing at all. Do you guys think of this as a climate thing? Because we really think of it as a, how do you change the entire economy thing? And this shows the proposal is less about the environment and more about a total government takeover of the economy. And, you can look at this from okay, well, what if we implemented the Green New Deal and what would that do for the environment? So Pat Michaels, he's a scientist, formerly at the Cato Institute, now at the Competitive Enterprise Institute. Him and Chip Knappenberger, sorry, probably butchered the last name pronunciation. But they did this. They took the model that was used by the Obama administration when they were putting together the Clean Power Plan, which was considered to be their signature climate change initiative, and said, what if we just totally eliminated all CO2 emissions from the United States? And by 2050, that would have averted 0.052 degrees C. And by 2100, you're looking at 0.1 4 degrees C of reduced global warming. And when you look at the annual, and this is from an article in Forbes that Pat Michaels wrote, looking at the IPCC's annual temperature history, which contains over 150 years, the year-to-year variation, standard deviation, is about 0.11 degrees C, which means the change of 0.14 is going to be very hard to detect. The amount that is saved is less than what normative science would call significant difference, 2 standard deviations. So basically, if we completely eliminated the CO2 emissions from the United States, it would not be scientifically detectable by 2100. And that means that, well, what are we giving up? What industries are we going to see under attack from regulations that are meant to reduce CO2 emissions or greenhouse gas emissions, if you want to include methane? And when you see that, it's going to transform American life completely. It's energy, it's agriculture, it's housing, it's transportation. It's all central planning. And, many of us are kind of live and let live. You do what you want to do, just don't ask me to pay for it. And we don't see this as an aggression on our way of life, but the other side does. And that means that we need to be prepared and we can't let them win. And a 100% carbon-free Minnesota. This is from the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. I just ran the numbers. They said that we emitted about 150 million tons in 2016. So if we completely wiped off CO2 emissions on the map in the state of Minnesota, it would avert 0.004 degrees C by 2100, which is many times less than, obviously the entire United States. So what are we doing? When we look at the policies that are being proposed by Governor Walz, they're very similar to the Green New Deal. One of the things that he wanted last year was a mandate to go 100% carbon-free in electricity generation by 2050, but it did not include new nuclear power plants. Nuclear power is actually illegal to build in the state of Minnesota, which is the absolute worst policy that you could have if you are concerned about climate change, because nuclear is really the only source of power that isn't dependent on the weather and can be carbon-free 24/7. Hydro is also more reliable than wind and solar, but it can be subject to drought. So Walz's Green New Deal relies on wind, solar, and batteries, which is impossibly expensive. It obstructs oil pipelines like Line 3. It doesn't protect agriculture. I'll talk about that in a second. He wants to mandate California car standards in the state, and it's kind of equally divorced from reality as AOC's. And the Green Leap Forward here, as I like to say in tongue-in-cheek, is really a war on greater Minnesota. Because liberal environmentalists, they don't know what it's like. I grew up on a small dairy farm in Wisconsin. You can actually see the picture of the family farm behind me here. And, the things that we need out in rural areas are affordable energy, reliable electricity. We use lots of diesel fuel on the farm, so we need pipelines. We need mining because all of our equipment is made out of metal. Who would have thought? We need mining. They want to regulate greenhouse gas emissions from farming, and they want to force us into California car standards. So first, I think it's important to give a big picture overview. Where does our energy come from? This is from the United States Energy Information Administration. I'm going to talk about them and call them EIA from this point forward. But 35% of all of our energy that we use on a daily basis comes from oil. So that's everything. That's the diesel generators at the hospital in case the power goes out. It's the ambulance. It's the semi-trucks that are hopefully hauling TP to Walmart right now. And the gas that we use to get to and from work. 15% of that energy is coal, and that's almost all electricity. Natural gas is, this kind of cut off half of the graph. Natural gas is 27% of our energy use. So gas is increasingly being used for electricity generation, but it's also the way 65% of Minnesotans heat their homes. 8% of our energy is nuclear. That's also electricity. 9% is biomass. That includes ethanol. And then 5% is wind. And in 2017, a big old goose egg or solar was a rounding error, essentially. So the idea that we're going to be able to completely transition away from fossil fuels, which provide the vast majority of our energy, is really foolish. And I'm going to elaborate on how divorced from reality that thought process really is if you're not going to embrace technologies like nuclear power or hydro. So obstructing new infrastructure, the current Line 3 is old and corroding, and it's at a higher risk of a spill than a new pipeline would be. So line 3 would potentially solve a few problems. It would allow producers in Canada to ship their crude oil to market in a faster and more efficient way. It would reduce the potential for a spill, and it would also employ a lot of people in the state of Minnesota. So it's a win-win-win. But this obstruction makes our energy system less secure because a new line 3 will be more important to the United States, to America, than all of Saudi Arabia. By the time this project is completed, we will import more oil into the country with line 3 than the Saudis. And that is a huge accomplishment. The movement against Minnesota agriculture, as a dairy farm kid, I feel I can make that joke. But environmental groups are suing the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency for not looking at regulating greenhouse gas emissions when they're permitting a dairy farm operation in southeastern Minnesota. This is insane. War on our cars. The Green New Deal calls for huge investments in high-speed rail and public transit. Public transit ridership right now during the coronavirus outbreak is down by something like 80% worldwide. This is a picture of the electric Sea Line that is now operating in Minnesota, but it was out of order for a really long time because there was a problem with the battery charger. But Walz wants to mandate the sale of electric cars in Minnesota and adopt California's fuel economy standards. The PCA thinks that, Pollution Control Agency thinks this will only increase car costs by $800, but auto dealers in Colorado determined it would be closer to $1,200 to $2,800. And the Walz administration also wants to give EV buyers a $2,500 rebate to reward them for, virtue signaling. But the thing about that is EV buyers are already wealthy. This is from EIA. Most of them already make over $100,000. And one study basically said EV buyers are predominantly white, wealthy liberals. So this is just kind of a kickback to the people that already support Walz, even though they probably don't see it that way. And then when you get into the electricity sector, it's really important to know that, following California is not a good idea. And I don't know if this is from this graphic. John, can you see my mouse as I'm moving it around?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. I don't know if it's from the Babylon Bee or whether it was from the Onion or something, but North Korea published a satellite image of California at night. You know how when you look on Google Earth and you see South Korea all lit up like a Christmas tree, and then the one black spot on the map at night is North Korea? Californians spend an extra $2.2 billion on contracts for renewable energy every year, and they don't spend nearly that much on trimming trees and making sure that their grid is resilient. In the case of the Santa Ana winds is what they were calling it. So they had to shut the power off to thousands of people, tens of thousands of people, and that's a huge economic cost. I mean, if we want to talk about this shutdown right now for the the mitigation of COVID-19, flattening the curve, et cetera, I mean, there's very few things that can even run if you don't have power. So that would be worse. And what have Californians received for their sacrifice? Just higher electricity prices. When you look at 2008, that's the year Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger signed an executive order mandating a significant portion of California's electricity come from renewables be enacted. They've far outpaced the national average in terms of their electricity costs. So right now I'm going to focus on electricity because this is really the part of the the Green New Deal that is closest, I think, to being implemented in the state of Minnesota. Obviously the governor is trying to circumvent the legislature by enacting California's car mandates through a rulemaking process, and he may well be successful at that, right? There's not a whole lot you can do when you just vest all this authority in the executive branch. But one of the big pushes is for a 100% renewable energy mandate. So the problem with this is wind and solar have already caused Minnesota electricity prices to skyrocket, and more of these energy sources will only make the situation worse. So here we go back to 2007 when the Next Generation Energy Act was signed into law by then Governor Tim Pawlenty. And you see that Minnesota's electricity prices have far outpaced the national average as a result of that. So increasing electricity prices harm low-income families and seniors the most. They have the less extra income in order to spend on basic necessities like electricity. So this is actually the Minnesota average monthly electric bill in 2018 dollars. So this isn't just some I don't know, hidden card trick with inflation. This is inflation adjusted dollars, and you see that electricity prices were pretty flat from 1997 until 2004. But what happened is in 2005, Xcel Energy was required to build wind in order to continue to store spent fuel at their nuclear power plants. So in 2005, 2006, 2007, you see this big increase in the cost of electricity. And it's actually correlated almost perfectly with rising amounts of renewable energy. And because Minnesota's electricity markets are basically a monopoly utility system, you can basically say this is causal, not correlation. And the fun thing about it is electricity bills have increased even though we use far less electricity than we used to. So the average use for Minnesota customers was about 830 kilowatt hours a month back in 2007. Now they're down by 670 probably, but the bills have increased in real dollars. So what's happening is we're using less electricity, but they keep raising the price of each individual kilowatt hour that we buy. And the problem is electricity rates are going to continue to skyrocket moving forward. When you see way back here, Mitch Rolling, our researcher, put this together. So big shout out to Mitch. In this part of the graph, you see that electricity rates were actually falling. And that's because we weren't really building anything new. But once this mandate got put in 2005, and all the utilities were subject to it in 2007, the price of electricity started to increase pretty rapidly. And the dotted lines here are what customers will pay if the rate increases that Xcel Energy and Minnesota Power, basically they want to increase the cost of electricity. And if they're allowed to do that, this is what people will be paying. And for all this trouble, our CO2 emissions have been very flat since 2012, which is when we started, we built a lot of wind from 2007 until this point. But one would think that if we're going to be having all these solar panels and wind turbines, that we'd have a lot more progress as a result of it. So why are prices rising? Wind and solar are more expensive than our existing power plants. They're dependent on the weather, which means they're less reliable than the plants that we already use, like our coal plants, our gas plants, and our nuclear plants. The grid is not a storage device, and wind and solar require more transmission infrastructure than conventional generators. And lastly, the intermittency, so the weather dependency of wind and solar, mean we still have to have natural gas or coal plants online to make sure the power doesn't go out when the wind isn't blowing or the sun isn't shining. All right, so here we go. This is the real cost of electricity by power plant. So we're just gonna look at the cost of electricity per megawatt hour. This is called the levelized cost of electricity. That's a fancy term, but just think of it in terms of, what's the cost of driving your car per mile that you drive, right? So let's say you go out and you buy a brand new Camry for like whatever, $20,000, whatever they sell for. I don't know. I don't shop for new cars. But you would divide the cost by how many miles you drive. So if you only drive a few miles, it would be an expensive car. But if you drive a lot, the cost per mile goes down, right? So the cost for these plants, we have the Sherco coal plant. We have the Boswell coal plant up in Cohasset that gives electricity to, well, not gives, it sells it to the iron mines. We have a natural gas plant owned by Xcel. We have the Prairie Island nuclear plant. And then we have the estimates for wind and solar that renewable energy advocates generally cite. They say, oh, well, wind is so cheap, solar is so cheap, but they're citing the subsidized cost, right? So once you add the subsidies back in, you've got at least $12 to $24 on wind, and I use the low end estimate just because why not? And then another $20 on top of solar. But the thing about Sherco, Boswell, and Prairie Island is we've already paid a lot of the capital cost for these resources. So, when you look at the property taxes, that's part of this, that's already baked into this cost that they're reporting to the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. And they've already paid for the transmission and they don't need other costs. So when you look at this, when you build more property or have more infrastructure, your property taxes go up. So that cost gets paid for by ratepayers. You also need more transmission lines when you're building wind and solar, because a lot of the wind and solar facilities that we're building, wind especially, are in Western North Dakota, or are in Western Minnesota, or in the Dakotas. So
hey guys,
you have
let me just pause you for a second to elaborate on that point a little bit. You know,
yeah.
they don't put up big wind turbine farms in Edina or Eden Prairie or North Oaks, right? Now, to be fair, it is windier in Western Minnesota and North Dakota than it is in the Twin Cities suburbs. So for whatever reasons, that's where they build these giant wind turbine farms that occasionally you'll see when you're driving in the countryside. But a wind turbine that's 200 miles from the Twin Cities doesn't do any good unless you build 200 miles worth of transmission lines. And that is both a huge cost, as you're pointing out here, and it's also a big environmental negative. Isn't that right?
Oh, absolutely. I'll elaborate on each of these little segments. But then you have utility profits. So every time that a utility company builds something, they're guaranteed to make a 7.5% profit on it. And you have another cost that's called load balancing. So that brings your total cost of wind up to about $84.54, and your cost of solar to $147. So, you know, if the wind isn't blowing, then you have to have some other source of generation. And that's what we call the load balancing cost. So first, subsidies don't reduce the cost of something. They just pay which pocket you have to pay it out of. So you can either have higher electric bills and higher tax bills, or you could just have higher electric bills. Increase in property taxes. John and I had a meeting with the chairman and CEO of Xcel Energy a few years ago, and we went into his office and we said, hey, so why does the cost of electricity keep increasing if you say that wind and solar are so cheap? And he kind of gave us like the standard conservative talking points that I'm sure he uses all the time. And he just kind of goes, well, oh, shucks, our property taxes just keep going up. And, you know, at first I was like, not sure how to interpret that information. But then I thought, well, maybe your property taxes are going up because you have more property to tax. And that's exactly what we've seen. Mitch put this graph together. And basically, since 2007, when we enacted the mandate for renewable energy in the state, we've seen a huge increase in the amount of property taxes that Xcel is paying. And ultimately, that's just another tax it's a hidden tax on your electric bill that everyone is paying. So when we're looking at transmission lines, most of the new wind turbines that are going in are not going in Minnesota. They're going in the Dakotas because it's windier there. And the way that wind turbines are subsidized, it's called a production tax credit. So they get a subsidy for every megawatt hour of electricity that they produce. And, you know, a megawatt hour is just a unit of electricity. Think of it as like a gallon of gasoline, right? So when you hear kilowatt hour, it's just a smaller gallon. Think of it as like a thimble, right? So Minnesota will need to spend billions of dollars on new transmission lines in the future to connect these wind turbines here to the Twin Cities metro area. And these cost $1 to $2 million per mile. And preliminary estimates that I've heard about the cost of the latest, round of transmission needed are somewhere in the neighborhood of 12 billion, but that's not official. So that's just the information that I have at this time. And let's talk about utility profits, because this is a big thing. I think conservatives, especially, need to understand how the business model of utilities work, because we have this tendency to just say, well, they're a private company, that's not my business. And that's a great attitude to have almost all the time, except for when it comes to monopoly utility companies that are approved by the government. Because normally we cheer when a company makes a profit, because it means they're winning market share, they're providing a superior product or service at a competitive price. But utility companies like Xcel Energy do not operate in a free market. They are given a service territory by the state of Minnesota, and they are legally the only entity that can sell there, and you're forced to buy your electricity from them. So in a free market, if somebody is charging you more or not giving you the service that you want, you can just say, okay, well, thanks, but no thanks. I'm going to go shop at Walmart instead of Target, right? Which is, probably sacrilege to say on a Minnesota specific webinar, but you have that option, but you do not have that option when it comes to electricity. So the trade-off that utilities make when they, allow for regulation or embrace regulation, however you want to say it, is that they aren't allowed to make a profit on the electricity they sell. Instead, they're guaranteed to make a profit every time they build something, whether it's a coal plant, a wind turbine, solar panel, or even new corporate offices. And the amount of money they make on this new asset declines over time with depreciation. And it gives them a huge financial incentive to shut down existing productive assets like coal plants and build new stuff at huge expense for the rest of us. So this is just kind of how it looks in a picture form. So the way that the profit works is Xcel Energy makes a 7.5% profit on the undepreciated amount of capital that it spends. So basically, think of it as your mortgage, right? So if you were able to buy a house and you got paid 7.5% on the cost of the house over 30 years, you would probably buy a really big, expensive house. You might even try to buy two. But every year, that asset depreciates a little bit in an accounting world. So the profit that they're making gets smaller on that asset. And once you get to about 30 years, that mortgage is totally paid off. So Xcel's not making any profit anymore. And this is great for ratepayers because that means that this asset is now able to produce the lowest cost source or the lowest cost electricity that it ever was. Because when that power plant was first built, you had to spend $90 a megawatt hour, and when you get here, you get to spend 30 or 40. But this is great for ratepayers, but it's bad for the company. So the company wants to retire that. And we see this all the time. So Xcel says, oh, well, we're going to go 100% carbon free by 2050. And when you look at the profits that they've made over the last, since that time, they've increased by a lot. They've increased by more than $500 million. And that's driven primarily by the fact that they're adding new renewable energy into their guaranteed profit pool. And the great thing about this is that by the time you pay off a wind turbine, it only lasts for 20 years, so you got to build a new one. So this is basically a perpetual cash machine. They just get to go back to the ATM, which is why they love them so gosh darn much. And it's basically the same with solar. They only last for 30 years. And I like to call it collusion. So it's no wonder that Xcel Energy has crafted friendly relationships.
Isaac, can you compare those 20 for wind turbines and 30 for solar? How long do nuclear plants, coal plants, gas, how long do they last?
Excellent question. I should have addressed that. So nuclear plants are now being approved to run for 80 years. So that's pretty great. I mean, that's huge. And, if your big thing is emissions, we want to reduce our emissions. The best way to do that for a long period of time is to build a nuclear power plant. The coal plants that we're running now could easily run for 60, 70, 80 years if you upgrade them, right? And natural gas plants also last for 30, 40, 50, 60 years. So, we are basically trading in these really reliable, dependable, long-lasting sources of electricity for things that don't last very long, and they're not reliable. Some people say, oh, well, this is just the regulatory environment that Xcel has to operate in. But they were the fourth largest lobbyist in the state of Minnesota in 2018. I think it'd be a mistake to say that they're a victim of public policy rather than actively.
Hey, Isaac, I think we should say here the fourth largest lobbyist. Yeah, and what do they lobby for? They lobby in favor of themselves being subjected to more mandates, requiring them to build more green energy. They lobby for that, not against it, because it makes them more money, right?
Yes, absolutely. So this picture here is really interesting because here you have J. Drake Hamilton, who is the leader of Fresh Energy. They're one of the top renewable energy special interest groups in the state of Minnesota. Here you have President Obama, and they're talking about the Clean Power Plan, which is basically a regulation designed to kill coal plants. And in the back, you've got Ben Folk, who is the CEO and president of Xcel Energy. So, there's all this, people say, oh, well, Xcel's so great. They're using the free market to go 100% carbon free. But it isn't the market that's choosing this. It's old-fashioned cronyism and rent seeking. So let's get into load balancing cost, because this is the most abstract, right? Wind and solar only produce electricity when the wind is blowing or the sun is shining. And that means other types of power plants must be available at the very second that you need the electricity to generate it. Because think about what happens when you unplug a lamp from the wall. It goes out virtually instantaneously. So this means that the supply of electricity on the grid must always be matched perfectly with demand. So if it's really windy one day, you need to back down a natural gas plant. Or if the wind doesn't show up to work that day, you need to increase the amount of electricity being generated from a, coal plant or a gas plant in order to make sure that the lights stay on. This is complicated by the fact that there is no way to store the electricity generated by wind and solar for a later date in any way that is even physically or economically feasible. And that's why I love this. This is from a CPAC event a few years ago where the president's just like, darling, is the wind blowing? I'd like to watch television. So this is a graph that shows wind and solar output during the polar vortex of 2019. So this black line shows the amount of electricity we needed, and this green shaded part shows the amount of electricity that was generated by wind. And if you squint real hard, maybe you can see the amount of electricity that was generated by solar. And it's not just during a polar vortex. Fun fact, at negative 22 degrees, it is too cold for a wind turbine to operate, and they actually need to consume electricity from the grid to heat the oil in their gearboxes in order to keep them from freezing and basically breaking the wind turbine. But it doesn't have to be negative 22 for the wind or solar, to not work very well. It can literally happen anytime. And we see this in the grid or in this graphic as well from February 5th to February 6th. So the big shell game here is we've already talked about the best.
Hey, Isaac, can I just put you on pause for a second there? Because I think there's two crucial numbers that we haven't quite put out there yet. This is an extreme example of the polar vortex, but if you average over the course of the year, what percentage of the time is a wind turbine actually producing electricity?
Yeah, so the most recent data from EIA said 33% in 2018. That's an artifact of a lot of different things. We have a lot of old wind turbines that are less productive. We have some newer ones that are more productive. Some of the newer ones are 45% of the time, but that still means 55% of the time you need to have something else to back up the wind. And solar is even worse. It's like 18.7% in a good year. 82% of the time, you need something better. Anything else, John?
No, that's good. I just want to make sure people understand.
Perfect.
A large majority of the time, these things aren't even producing electricity. So what do? You burn natural gas, you burn coal, you do nuclear. A large majority of the time.
And that is the reason why, Xcel says, oh, well, we're replacing replacing our coal with wind and solar, and that's not really true. They're replacing your coal plant here that you've already paid for with 1.6 megawatts of wind, 0.6 megawatts of solar, and then enough natural gas to make sure that even if these two things are producing zero electricity, you have enough power plants available online to make sure that the lights stay on, right? So that's the big dirty secret, I would say, about all this renewable energy, puff piece, punditry that we have in the spirit of alliteration, is that you need to spend about $4 million on all of these other sources of electricity in order to replace the one thing that you already have and you already paid for. So, wind and solar don't exist on their own. They only exist on a grid that is, supplied by natural gas when you need the electricity and the weather isn't cooperating. So in my opinion, they are very expensive hood ornaments that do not work very often. And lastly, we got to talk about the fact that the grid is not a bathtub. And I talked about this a little bit. So a lot of people think, well, wind and solar aren't so bad. You let the turbine spin during the night and then you just use the electricity later. But we've already talked about how that is not the case. So, you would need some sort of battery storage in order to make this viable, but they are impossibly expensive. This is a slide from Xcel looking at how much it would cost to go from, the current levels of electricity to a 100% renewable energy mandate with battery storage. And right now, residential customers in Minneapolis are spending about 13 cents a kilowatt hour, which is $1. So let's just not do that. So the system cost of this is $1,612 per megawatt hour. But if you broke that down, that'd be $1.60 a kilowatt hour, which is about 10 times more than we're currently paying. So this means that your monthly electric bill would increase from about $91.30 to a cool $1,036 or more than $1,200 per year. And, you know, it just kind of shows that wind, solar, and storage is an unworkable solution, but it's often portrayed as this, you know, wonderful fix-all for the intermittency of wind and solar, when really that's not realistic at all.
Yeah, Isaac, could we go back to that last chart just for a moment?
Yeah.
So I want to make sure this is clear to everybody. When you point out to people that wind and solar are never going to work, because the majority of the time they don't produce any electricity at all, the answer you'll often get from the environmentalist is, well, we know the grid doesn't store electricity. That's true. But what we can do is we can have giant batteries. We can have the wind turbine spin, the sunshine, the electricity goes into a giant battery, gets stored there, and then we put it out onto the grid when it's needed. That's an answer that you'll pretty often get from environmentalists. Now, does Xcel own any such giant batteries?
No, nobody does.
Say it again.
So you'll hear stories about Tesla's battery in Australia or the ones that they're building in California. But when you look at the fact that, you know, they would provide less than a minute of electricity if the whole grid was depending on it, it's really not a workable solution. I mean, you would need tons of them. You would need to way overbuild in the battery department because it's windiest in the spring, in the winter here in Minnesota, and in the fall, and it's least windy during the summer. So you'd have to have enough battery storage to store all the wind that's generated in the early part of the year for the dog days of summer when wind turbines are producing like 15% of their potential.
Well, and the bottom line of that, Isaac, as I understand it, is that battery storage is unbelievably expensive. I mean, we all have batteries in our phones and our laptops, but to talk about trying to store the entire needs of the state of Minnesota, even for an hour on batteries, is just prohibitively expensive. Isn't that the—
Yes, I mean, you're talking trillions of dollars for not hours, but I think I crunched the numbers on 1 day's worth of battery storage, and it was in the billions with a B, so that's significant. So basically, MIT did a study. I should have had that slide in here, but it shows the same thing as Xcel. Like when you're allowed to use things like natural gas or coal to balance the grid, right, load balance, then you can keep your costs relatively low. But if you're not going to allow for anything like that, you're looking at an exponentially more expensive source of electricity. And here's the slide, or here's some of the information John was talking about earlier. But I do want to say, if you care about global warming, you should not be a fan of wind and solar because they don't work very well. So the wind in 2017 was a little better. It worked 36% of the time, but you don't know when that's going to happen. So it's not like you can just say, oh, well, you know, we can retire 36% of our coal plants because we got this wind coming online. And the same with solar. So this is the polar vortex, right? This is the point in our, you know, probably the last 2 years where our grid needed the power the most, because otherwise people are going to die. I mean, I've got a gas boiler and the circulation pumps all run on electricity. So if we don't have electricity, even my natural gas system is worthless, right? So the vast majority of our power came from coal. This is from a application called Electricity Map. So if you want to see where your electricity is coming from in real time, I highly encourage you to download that on your phone or just check it out on the web. So nuclear power plants were run in slow and steady. The wind did not show up to work during this because it was too cold for the wind to generate electricity. They had to shut the turbines down. And the remainder of it was provided by natural gas. And the cool thing about Electricity Map is that it will show you in real time where, you know, the carbon intensity of the electricity that you're consuming is. So in the Mid-Continent Independent Systems Operator, which is basically just the grid that Minnesota exists in, we were very CO2 intensive because we were burning a lot of coal. But up here in Ontario, Canada, they were very green, and they were only very green because they have a lot of nuclear, they have a lot of hydro, and they have wind, but they don't try to depend on it. So if you are looking for something that can deliver carbon-free electricity around the clock, regardless of the weather conditions, you need to embrace these two sources of electricity. But the way that the current renewable energy mandate in Minnesota is drafted, it's illegal to even count the large hydro that we already import from Canada to count toward that standard. And that was designed specifically as a carve out for the wind and solar industry, mostly the wind industry at that time because solar was too expensive. And you need to lift the current ban that we have on building new nuclear power plants. That's it. That's it. I mean, you can't, I think it's really funny. There are models that people who are trying to figure out what are the weather patterns going to be in Minnesota moving forward if climate change is as bad as we think it's going to be. And it shows that the wind speeds are going to be reduced in the middle of the country. So North Dakota, South Dakota, Minnesota, because the difference between the temperature at the equator and the poles will shrink. Basically, it won't be as different, and that will weaken the jet stream. So the idea that we need to build wind and solar that would be affected by future global warming to fight global warming doesn't really make any sense. And, you know, when we're talking about this, this isn't field of dreams. It's not if you build it, the electricity will come. So this is from EIA, and it shows that wind generation, so the amount of electricity that the wind turbines have produced, has actually, you know, not passed the 2017 level, even though we have more turbines operating today than we did back in 2017. And, you know, Minnesota is not a great place to build solar. This is from EIA. It shows the solar radiance map. We're up here in the Midwest where, you know, Michigan is worse, but Wisconsin, Minnesota, North Dakota, not great places to build solar. And that's why you really don't see a ton of solar in this area of the country. But in Minnesota, we subsidize it and we actually mandate it. We have to get 1.5% of our electricity from solar as part of our updated renewable energy mandate. And solar doesn't work very well any time of the year. It's probably peaking at like 30% in July. But in December, it gets down even further. It gets down to about 6% because the days are so much shorter. And it is too expensive to clear snow off of the solar panels. This is from Ralph Jacobson, the founder of IPS Solar, basically saying it would be cost prohibitive to pay somebody to clean the snow off the solar panels. So my thing is, if we are going to pretend that this is a free market and solar is winning, how? Because any business that cannot operate in Minnesota because it's snowing is not a viable business model. I'm just going to say it. All right, so what did we do? We fought back, and we continue to do so. So we published this report, Doubling Down on Failure, which John mentioned did win Most Influential Research at State Policy Network's annual dinner last year. And we feel this is the most comprehensive study on the cost of renewable energy mandates in the state of Minnesota. And we basically concluded that this will impact the affordability of electricity for all Minnesotans and increase costs by $80.2 billion through 2050. And that would in turn result in a 40% increase in the cost of electricity. So here are the 10,000 foot view of this. Your average electric bill would increase by about $375 per year. But that's not the whole cost that you would pay, because realistically, the school is going to have a higher electricity cost as well. So what are they going to do? Probably going to raise your taxes. The same with City Hall. They're going to say, oh, well, look how green we are, but your taxes are going up. So the real cost would probably be closer to $1,200 per year, which would destroy about $3.1 billion in the state's GDP, destroy 21,000 jobs. We always hear about, oh, well, wind and solar are creating so many jobs. We would actually lose about twice as many jobs as the wind and solar industry create. And John Phelan and Martha have done a really good job showing that the productivity of the jobs in these industries is actually really low. But the real kicker is it's 0.006 degrees C of global warming by 2100. Why, when they talk about how many tons of CO2 that they're going to be averting, don't they ever run the numbers and tell you how much of a global temperature you would avert? And the reason's easy. I mean, it's obvious why they don't say that, because nobody's going to say, oh yeah, I would love to pay $1,200 a year to avert something that is completely immeasurable in my grandchildren's lifetime. So the alternatives, though, are...
Before we move on to the alternatives, I think one point that we want to make sure we emphasize is that the analysis you did was of a 50% renewable mandate.
Yes.
Well, by the time the legislative session was done last year, there was a bill introduced. They pulled that bill. There was a bill introduced for a 100% renewable mandate, which A, is not even possible, but B,
correct,
the cost of that would be exponentially greater, right?
Yes. Yes. Thank you for clarifying. We gave them the benefit of the doubt, and we were wrong. So the alternatives are nuclear power. So what if we went totally, or what if we went, instead of building all this renewables, what if we built new nuclear power plants? And that would increase costs by about $60 billion through 2050. The other scenario, it was called our long-term nuclear scenario, which is the one I think that is the most practical out of all of these. If you're concerned about reducing CO2 emissions, is okay, we have these coal plants, they're already paid for, they're only gonna last so long though. So why don't we use them, generate affordable electricity from them while they're still useful, and then have a plan to replace them with nuclear power. And that was gonna cost about $28 billion. And then we said, you know what, the Trump administration has released the Affordable Clean Energy Rule, which is a replacement for the Clean Power Plan. So what impact would that have on our electricity sector? And you would actually save about $7.5 billion through 2050 compared to today's prices, right? So when I say it'll cost all of this, this is an additional cost. This is on top of what we're already paying. And it's important to stress that. And, for all of the press that wind and solar get, they're still far less of a generator for carbon-free power than nuclear power. So, hydro is about 2%. So I did not include it in here, but we've spent more than $15 billion promoting wind and solar in this state. And if we'd concentrated on nuclear instead, we'd be a lot more carbon free. It's interesting. There's something called an APR 1400. It's made by a South Korean company. It's giant. It's essentially a giant nuclear reactor. And building one of those in Minnesota would generate more electricity than the entire wind fleet. So when we're talking about practical ways to reduce emissions, some people say, oh, well, you guys just don't want to reduce emissions at all. It's just like, well, if you're going to do it in the smartest way possible. But that's not the world we live in. So this is a meme I made last year. So it's just the Walz and the DFL House climate stance. They basically say climate change is an existential crisis, but no nuclear or large hydro. And then when the system doesn't work, they blame the fossil fuel companies. So let's talk about some of the negative consequences of this. So, skyrocketing electricity prices threaten the mining industry. It would essentially cost an extra $200 million every year, which is the equivalent of 2,500 high-paying mining jobs. And the Mintac mine in Mountain Iron uses more electricity and natural gas than the entire city of Minneapolis. So these are enormous consumers of electricity. Impact on schools, we ran the numbers. You'd have to lay off 33 teachers making $56,000 a year in order to pay for the higher electric bills if we decided to go 50% renewable. It would also reduce our manufacturing. Manufacturing is the single largest sector, private sector component of Minnesota's economy. So it's 16% of the total GDP. And when you look at California, since they enacted their even stricter renewable energy standards than in 2008, their employment in the manufacturing sector has lagged the national average as companies look to build and essentially export their jobs to other states and countries. So just going to leave you with this. No sources of energy that only work some of the time and you don't know when that is could ever survive in a competitive and free market. So we have them because of federal subsidies for wind and solar that drive their growth. Minnesota mandates that 25% of our electricity come from renewables, 1.5% of that must be solar. And then you get back to the fact that these government-approved monopolies are padding their corporate profits. And it's just all of the demand for wind and solar is driven by, government-approved rent-seeking or just government mandates. And here you see a cool graphic from EIA, the Energy Information Administration, that shows once the subsidies expire, nobody's building wind. So I think, even the forecasters at EIA are in agreement about that. So here's the, Minnesota's building so much solar. Well, you mandated it. Of course you did. So remember, take this away, ladies and gentlemen. Electric companies are not private companies. They are government-approved monopolies, and you can't choose who your electric provider is, just like your family. And that's it. Thank you.
All right, fantastic, Isaac. In the time remaining, let's take some questions. I'll pick a few out of the chat stream here. One viewer asks, what percentage of your subscribers are outside of Minnesota? Your work is exceptional. and needs to get to as many states and people as possible. Isaac, you're working on that. Can you just briefly sum up what you're doing to export this work to other states?
Yeah. So Mitch Rolling, who was instrumental in the writing of Doubling Down on Failure, has worked on a model that will allow us to help other states figure out the cost of electricity mandates in their states as well. We have a few states around the Midwest, North Dakota, Michigan, Iowa, and we're hoping that every state in the country who's got an organization that's interested in this issue will come to us and say, hey, how about you help us out? And we'll say, yeah, sounds good.
Here's a question from a viewer. Why, and this is something I've wondered about, why are environmentalists opposed to nuclear power? Is there a short answer to that question, Isaac?
Well, no. One of the big arguments is the waste, but all the waste is contained on site. It's in a concrete cask. Nuclear power generates less waste than any other source of electricity per megawatt hour produced. I was lying when I said I didn't have another slide. It costs $532,000 to decommission every single wind turbine, and the blades aren't recyclable. So they end up in a landfill in Wyoming or South Dakota. So this idea that, wind and solar are this kind of cost-free source of power is just incorrect. So, a lot of the nuclear fuel can get reprocessed. France does this. We don't allow that in the United States because of Jimmy Carter. I think a lot of it stems back to the bomb. People are afraid of atomic energy for that reason. And I think that, as we get further away from Dr. Strangelove, that is fading a little bit, but it's still something that we need to overcome.
Here's a question about coal plants that I don't know the answer to. One of our viewers asks, older coal plants are being retired because they cannot meet new environmental standards mandated by the EPA and state regulators. Is that right, Isaac? I think the standards have gone back and forth a little bit. What's the status of that?
Yeah, that's absolutely true. One of the things that I didn't talk about that wish I had is the air in the United States is cleaner now than it has been any time in the last several decades. And that's because of standards, that's because of efficiency improvements. So some power plants are going offline because of regional haze standards, and it just costs too much money to upgrade them. So sometimes that's the case, but sometimes it's not. Like the Sherco plants that Xcel wants to shut down already meet all of those standards. They just want to shut it down because they want to build other stuff. So sometimes it makes sense from a cost benefit analysis to just say, hey, you know what, this coal plant had a good run, but other times it doesn't.
Here's a question, kind of along the lines of a prior one, but one viewer asks, so how do you get this message out to the whole of the population? Well, let me answer that one, Isaac, at least first. We make a major effort to get our information in front of as many Minnesotans as possible. We track our efforts very conservatively, very carefully, and we get our messages in front of Minnesotans tens of millions of times every year. We do that through all kinds of media. We do things like we're doing here today, but we also put up billboards. We put up billboards around greater Minnesota. Wind energy is not the answer, with a URL, mngreenenergyfails.com, and tens of thousands of people. I don't know how many people saw the billboards, a million, I suppose, I don't know. Tens of thousands of people actually went to that page and learned a lot of this information that Isaac had put together on why it is that wind energy is not the answer. We put ads on the radio. We do all kinds of things to get our messages, including on energy, in front of as many Minnesotans as possible. That costs money. And if you want to help us get our messages in front of more and more people, go to our website, americanexperiment.org. There's a donate button, a red donate button that you'll see pretty prominently, and we welcome your contribution. Here's a question that came in kind of early. Can you explain to me how a wind turbine can be turning on days when there is no wind? Can that happen, Isaac?
Maybe it's not windy down at the ground level, but when you get up into, they build the wind turbines taller and taller to get access to the wind up there. So I think that's probably what that is.
Yeah, in other words, it's windier. These wind turbines are 50 stories high, right? This is the height of the IDS Center or the Wells Fargo Center.
And they're getting bigger all the time.
Yeah, they get bigger all the time. It's a lot windier up there typically than it is on the ground. Let's see, what else? Here's a question. You know, you talked about a couple of questions about Xcel and its lobbying activities. I think a lot of people are shocked by this. I think there's a misunderstanding where some people say, well, gee, if the utility is telling us all the time, wind is great, green is great, you know, we can trust the utility. They don't understand that for the utility, that's where the money is. These fully depreciated coal plants or nuclear plants, they just get paid to operate them. If you want the 7.5% return on a capital investment along with guaranteed return of capital, then you have to build something new and get it put into your rate base. And so one of our viewers asks, equal opportunity lobbyist, ? Or partisan specific? And I think the answer is equal opportunity. There are Republicans that fall for this stuff too.
Oh, absolutely. And that's why what we're doing right now is so important, right? So I think that one of the best things that we can do is educate conservatives that, you know what, they're a private company. They can do whatever they want is a great advice for pretty much every other sector of the economy. But when you're looking at utilities like Xcel Energy, that turns on its head because your customer has no recourse to say, you know what, absolutely, I'm not going to pay for this extra cost. I would rather go and buy from a co-op.
And so one of our readers then says, so Xcel is lobbying against its customers? Wow, that is exactly correct. That viewer got the point precisely. Xcel is lobbying against its customers. You know, you talked a little bit about transmission lines and the huge cost of transmission lines. One of our viewers asked a really good question. How far can electricity be transmitted efficiently? And there is a loss when you transmit electricity over long distance. Is that right?
Yeah. So you can eliminate or reduce line loss by having high voltage direct current lines. So basically, these are very high capacity lines meant to limit the amount of loss. There's a giant. So Great River Energy operates a plant called Coal Creek out in North Dakota, and they ship that electricity to the co-ops basically. So it's a very important plant. It's one of the lowest cost, most reliable sources of electricity, and they utilize that high voltage line to make sure that they're providing that electricity to their customers.
I want to go back to a question that we got from our friend Alex Karam early in the presentation. And he says, recently a quote, Republican close quote lobbying group began working with an energy group that calls itself Minnesota Conservative Energy Forum, led by former GOP House staffers. They recently published an editorial saying that the center and you, Isaac, have quote, distorted the facts. They've gone to bat for wind and solar, saying they are great sources of energy. And Alex wonders, do you have a response to them? Alex, this is a group that you are well aware of, I know. Tell us a little bit about this.
Yeah, so this group is funded by leftists. When you look at their lobbying report, it's people that take money from the Energy Foundation, which used to be very closely related to Tom Steyer, who was the climate change candidate in the primaries. So the Conservative Energy Network gets their money from the McKnight Foundation, which is the same group that funded Jamie Long for his position at the university before he resigned, that was basically designed to combat the work of a local right-wing think tank, which was us, which was center of the American experiment. So these people are, their job is to provide plausible deniability for Republicans who like the idea of wind and solar, and that's kind of the whole point of it. So their arguments fall flat on their face. Please send me this article because this is grist for the mill in terms of
there's a link to it which we'll have for you, Isaac.
Oh, perfect.
But you have gone after this group in the past, right?
Oh, for sure. Yeah, I've got a few blog posts up there. I haven't even gone after them as badly as I wanted to. So this is very fun.
Yeah, well, you'll have your opportunity. Maybe just one more question. Our time is up here, but one of our viewers asks what I think is a really interesting question, something that you've been giving a lot of thought to, and that is, any chance Minnesota citizens can buy from non-in-state electric power generators? How about that?
So they can, if your co-op buys from an out-of-state generator, right? And really what'll happen in the future is Xcel's already saying that at some point they won't have enough reliable power plants to provide all of their electricity needs. So they're going to have to buy from the grid or the Mid-Continent Independent Systems Operator. So there is like a mechanism for companies to do that, but there's no mechanism for individuals to do that. And I think that's really where a lot of the focus needs to go is, empowering or individuals to choose where they get their electricity from. Because like I said, if I want to buy power from Minnesota Power's Boswell plant or Coal Creek or something like that and pay much less for that electricity, as a consumer, that would give the utility a positive signal that says, hey, I appreciate the service. It's reliable, it's affordable, and I don't want all of the window dressing.
And that may be an avenue that we could advocate in the future. Is that right, Isaac? To try to open up these energy markets and say, if Xcel's prices keep going like this and this and this, well, let's see who else we might buy our electricity from.
Yeah, I think that, some legislation that says, look, if your electricity prices are above the national average, your ratepayers get to look elsewhere. That seems very reasonable to me, because it gives the utilities a price signal that says you can't just keep raising the prices forever. And that's important.
Well, I'd love to keep going with this because I know how much more Isaac knows because I work with him every day, and we could go for a long time. But our time is up. Thanks to everybody for attending today. And please come back. Next week, Martha Jola-Moley, who's our brand new economist working with John Phelan, is going to be doing a presentation on the costs of regulation. And that's actually a week from tomorrow. That's going to be Thursday next week instead of Wednesday. And then the following Wednesday, we'll have the 5th program in this masterclass series. That's going to be by Jeff Johnson, former gubernatorial candidate, who is going to be talking about why it is that the Twin Cities have such expensive housing. And that too is one that that you are not going to want to miss. So one of our viewers says, my questions didn't get addressed. Is that a flaw in Zoom? No, that's a fact that we ran out of time. We didn't have time for everybody's questions, but we were able to get to some of them. So thanks everybody for participating, and we'll hope to see you again a week from tomorrow. Thanks again. Bye-bye.